I had them check me for dilation, and at this point I was just hoping that I was at a 7. I was like, okay, if I'm at a 7, we can do this. That's what I was expecting. This is actually when I found out some shocking news that there was not going to be a tub available for me. My husband wrote down at 12:08 that I entered my growling phase of labor. I do remember thinking though directly after, like, I am never doing that again. How could I have just birthed 2 babies at home unmedicated? Like, who does this? Hi friends, how's it going? We are back and we have a little baby this time around. This is our second son, Lucas Lloyd, and he is snoozing pretty good right now. I wanted to kind of create a little sit-down story time to fill in some of the details that were not hit on in that birth vlog. The actual birth itself, we did not end up recording. He came very fast, and so the whole thing, we're trying to figure out this new camera and then also figure out birth, so there was a lot happening. So I wanted to create this kind of sit-down story time so that we can discuss those details, and I will fill in any gaps here. But if you're new to this channel or new to any of my videos, I have had a home birth before. So little Lucas is my second home birth. He was born on November 6th, and his brother Henry was born 2 years ago in 2022 in October. And so he was my first home birth baby. This is my second, and so I'm going to go over how labor went and all the ups and downs of the experience. Okay, so my due date with Lucas was November 9th, and with Henry, I actually ended up going into labor 2 days before Henry's due date. So I kind of had that on my radar that maybe I would go into labor early with him, and I started on and off having pre-labor contractions starting on November 2nd. And so my biggest thing was just to make it into the month of November, since he was due early November. I was hoping that the boys would have their own birthday month, so I was hoping and praying that we would at least make it into November, which we did. And the biggest distinction, I would say, between Henry's start of labor and Lucas's start of labor is that I did not get any preterm labor with Henry. As soon as I had the first contraction, labor just started and did not stop until Henry was born, and that was a 27-hour process from start to finish. This time around, that was one of the things I prayed for, is that labor would start sooner and all the pre-labor, early labor stuff would happen kind of off and on, so that once I started labor, I was actually more in active labor. That way the overall time of labor would be reduced. And so that prayer was definitely answered. So I was having on and off contractions from about the 2nd through the 5th, which I did talk about in the vlog right before this one, so I'll link that up here if you haven't seen that one. I actually vlogged until I went into labor. So that first clip, or the last clip of that video, was actually on the night of 11/5, and so it was at 1:30 in the morning, and so that was actually 1:30 in the morning on the 6th on that day. Okay, so I'm going to read some notes that I have in my phone from that day. So on November 5th, I put on 3 p.m. I had loud gurgle noises from my tummy and then a sudden onset of an upset stomach. And so that was identical to how I went into labor the first time. And then at 7 p.m. on that day, I put contractions were ramping up slightly, and it was still early stages and they were still inconsistent, and I hopped in a warm bath to help slow them down. That was successful in slowing them down. But then at 1:30 on the 6th, I woke up with contractions consistently coming on. I worked to sleep through them, but it became more challenging in a side-lying position. I hate laboring in a side-lying position, and so you can only really sleep in your 3rd trimester in a side-lying position, and so I had a really hard time sleeping through them. At 2:30 a.m. I noted that contractions were intensifying, and I moved myself out into the living room so that my activity kind of going up and down wouldn't wake up my husband Paul, because essentially I was trying to sleep through them between contractions, but then one would come on and I would hop out of bed and then I would hop back in bed. And so I was afraid the hopping in and out of bed would wake up my husband, and I wanted him to be well rested if it was, you know, baby go time. So then I moved myself out into the living room. At 3:30 a.m. I texted my midwife to let her know that contractions had been intensifying since 1:30. They were 50 to 70 seconds long and 5 to 7 minutes apart, and I felt I was in early active labor at that point. At 5 a.m. I woke up my husband to let him know that we should set up all the birth space, like the birth balls, labor swing, etc. And I remember specifically telling him that at 5 a.m. I think that we're going to have a baby by noon, and we ended up having my son at 12:46. So I was very on the nose in terms of the timing there, but I was getting frustrated because at 5:30 I called my midwife to tell her that it was baby time, and she was saying it still sounded early in terms of the contraction timing, which I remember getting frustrated about because my contractions were on the shorter side, but they felt so intense that I just wanted, you know, some more support to be there. So I remember being a little bit frustrated at that and just wanting, you know, someone to listen to me, that I felt that labor was starting. At 6 a.m. I got in the bath for some pain relief, and I didn't love how the positions were feeling in there, and I started listening to my praise music at this point, the playlist that I set up. I'll link that down below because that really helped me in labor. At 7:15, the contractions were intensifying, and I started crying at this point because I felt like I was back into like the labor space, and I didn't realize how much trauma from my first birth was still buried until I reached that space. And it's like all the emotions from my first birth bubbled up again, and it was just a very like overwhelming experience. But I just dialed back in. I let the tears come so that I could clear that fear and that anxiety, but it was definitely like kind of anxiety of like, okay, labor is ramping up. I remember how this feels. The only way out is through kind of situation. So that's definitely how I felt at like 7:15. At 7:45, my mom arrived to pick up my son Henry. She was gonna watch Henry for the full day. And so at this point, this is where we got all of those pictures in the birth space that I used in my birth reel. And I started vocalizing through these contractions at this point. I felt I moved from early active labor to active labor at around 7:45, 8. And Henry was a cute distraction, I wrote down. He started copying my blowing noises, so I was like breathing through contractions pretty crazy, like, and then he started copying me, which was so funny. And he also wanted to play on the peanut ball, which was adorable. Okay, sorry about that. My camera died, and then baby's starting to wake up just a little bit here. So we will press on with the story. Let's see, where was I? At 8:15, I said, I felt like I was tumbling under the contractions instead of riding above them. And my mom really helped. So my mom had 5 home births, and having her there actually was super, super helpful because she reminded me that by using my breathing, I could kind of separate myself from the contractions. And that mentality or that visualization was actually so important and vital. Essentially, as the wave would come on, I would picture the breathing would carry me above the wave of the contraction. That was really powerful for me, and I was really grateful that she was there to remind me of that. I feel like, and I wrote down that that was a big victory over last time, where I feel like I could never really get to that place where I was kind of riding ahead of the contraction, and I feel like I was able to get there during this stage. At 8:45, my mom left with my son Henry, and then I wrote down that things were starting to pick up. I wanted the birth tub to be in the space, and because the positions were feeling awkward in my own tub, and so I texted my midwives that I was like ready for them to come over and to bring the tub over. And this is actually when I found out some shocking news that there was not going to be a tub available for me. So I had talked with my midwives that I wanted a water birth, I wanted a tub at my birth, and I did not realize, it was kind of partially my error for not like communicating well, but the birth tubs were kind of a first come first serve situation, and they had them already out with other moms at this time. And so there was not a birth tub available when I was giving birth, and I did not know that that was going to be a possibility. Otherwise, I would have, you know, purchased and had my own tub set up in the future. If we have another one, if we do another home birth in the future, I will say that we'll definitely have that figured out and done independently in the future. But at this point in labor, it was about 8:45 a.m., almost 9 a.m. I was told that there was not going to be a tub, and I started freaking out because the tub and the water therapy at my birth is what really helped me get through transition. And I did not know how I was going to get through that without the water. And so I started just kind of freaking out, getting really frustrated with my tub and how the things that we used to try to make the bottom of it softer were all like floating up between contractions. It was like this awkward positioning. I didn't love it because I wanted to be kind of like leaned over the comfy cushioned blow up section, and so my tub at home was very hard, and so I couldn't lean over like I wanted to, and so that was the primary reason that that wasn't working. So I just decided, look, we're not gonna have a tub. I have to adjust. I have to get back into a positive headspace, and so I have to find the positions that were working well up to this point in order to carry me through, because at this point I was entering transition. And so I told my midwives, okay, it is time for you to come. Things are picking up. I had to kind of get over the tub situation, even though I was really, really upset by that. And so they ended up, I told them that at 10, that I was ready for them to come. They were really intensifying. And what was interesting and kind of crazy is that, okay, so we moved back into the living room. I wrote down at 10 a.m. I put on like relaxing running water on the TV to just have a relaxing background, feel like I was in nature. And then I also, so I was taking contractions standing up with my husband applying counter pressure, or on hands and knees over a bouncy ball. So I was kind of between those two positions with my husband providing counter pressure as well. So at 11:15, my midwife team all arrived. There was 3 of them total, my main midwife, midwife's assistant, and then a student midwife there at my birth. So they all arrived at 11:15. I really appreciated it because they came in with such positive energy, and I really needed that in the space. And so that was really, really helpful. I had them check me for dilation, and at this point I was just hoping that I was at a 7. I was like, okay, if I'm at a 7, we can do this. That's what I was expecting. And they checked me and they said that I was at a 9, and my cervix there was no swelling with my cervix. So I was so happy. I was literally so happy that I was at a 9, and I had gotten myself to a 9 completely just on my own, like without any help, without any, like just with my own coping. I had reached a 9, which was so incredible. And a really interesting thing that I started doing at this point when I was in transition after I was at a 9 is I had watched a video that said, and also just read this in Ina May's Guide to Childbirth, is that if you talk to your cervix and ask it to open, it will actually open for you. And so I probably sounded a little bit crazy, but I was actually in labor and I would say like open, talking to my cervix and asking it to open. The first time I said that, I went to the bathroom right after and I noticed bloody show. The second time I said it, I noticed, or I lost my mucus plug. And so I actually had reached a 9 without losing my mucus plug and without my water having broken. So at this point, both were intact, but I started asking my cervix to open. And so I noticed bloody show for the first time. After I did, then I lost my mucus plug, and then my water still had not broken. By around, let's see, I put 11:15 to 12:08 that I was starting to bear down. And then I took a few more big contractions standing up and using the labor swing. I had the midwives use some essential oils at this point upon my request to kind of help me relax after each contraction, because they were starting to get really intense at this point. Standing up still felt effective but a bit uncomfortable, so I had decided to go down on hands and knees. At 12:08 I was on hands and knees, and I really started aggressively bearing down at this point. And so this is when I wrote down that I started entering my pushing phase, although this was still kind of like the transition phase. So I actually don't know whether I would put my pushing phase at 30 minutes or if it was like literally like 2 minutes or 10 minutes. No, yeah. So it was either 30 minutes or 10 minutes. I'm not sure, because 30 minutes is when I was bearing down a lot. But the pressure that I was feeling, because there was so much pressure that I was feeling at this point, they said that my water had not broken, but it was bulging. And so at this point, the water was adding all of this extra pressure, and baby's head was directly behind it. And so they offered that they can put some counter pressure, my midwives did, counter pressure during a contraction to help it break. And so I waited for 3 more contractions after they offered it to see if my water would break on its own, because I really wanted it to. The pressure was so intense at this point, I was having a really hard time coping. But I will say this was another prayer answered, is I was working on positive self-talk this entire labor, because with my first labor with Henry, I was doing a lot of negative self-talk. I would say things like, I can't do this, this is impossible, this is too hard, things like that. Every time I felt that or had a thought, I would say the opposite of what I was feeling. So I would say things like, I can do this, I am strong enough for this. That was so helpful to just transform that self-talk during this period, but it was becoming very hard to cope. And so I wrote down, and this was actually, my husband was writing down these notes for me. Obviously, I did not know what time it was. I did not know it was 12:08 when I started like pushing, all of that stuff. Also, I thought it was hilarious because my husband wrote down at 12:08 that I entered my growling phase of labor. So obviously this is when the vocalization became very primal, was at 12:08. And yeah, so that's kind of when pushing started, definitely when bearing down happened, but baby's head was not all the way through my cervix at this point, so I don't even know if kind of pushing was happening, kind of not. IDK. I was still kind of at 9 centimeters trying to get to 10. So at 12:35, they decided to use the counter pressure thing. I asked them to, and my water broke. My water broke during this counter pressure, and and they told me that this would happen, and I'm really glad that they braced me for it, but it still did not fully prepare me for the sensation that this would bring, which is that my water broke, and then his head came down so fast and so aggressively behind the water. And I remember saying just out loud, because I felt like he was gonna come all the way out, and it was such a sudden change that I was like, I need a break. And I remember reading that sometimes for women, they can talk to their body and request a break and ask for their body to give themselves a break before they push their baby out. So I was kind of doing that with that in mind, thinking maybe if I say this out loud, my body will give me a break before I start pushing. But I just said, I need a break, hoping that I would get a break before pushing. So I would say maybe my pushing phase was actually a little closer to 10 minutes, because I think this might have been when his head entered the birth canal. And I said, in about 3 more contractions, and this is based off of notes from my husband because I did not remember these details. So in about 3 more contractions, baby's head started to crown. It was a very sudden feeling. Like Henry felt like a very gradual moving down with each contraction, but this was like all at once. So then his head came out with a large contraction. There was like 3 surges in the same contraction, and his head was born. And I heard them all say like, head is out, head is out, head is out, and his body was still in. And so with Henry, I actually pushed his head and body out in 1 surge. And with little one, with Lucas, I pushed his head out with 1 and then had like this break, but there was such a relief. Even though I knew his body had to come, it was such a relief knowing that his head was born. And then at 12:46, another contraction came, and he was born the rest of the way. So that's when he came. So at this point, all of this at 12:08 on, I was leaning over that bouncy ball on hands and knees in my living room. And so we had everything all covered in the living room. And so that's where I ended up delivering him. And so they kind of coached me on this, like how they would hand him to me in that position is basically like they would give him up through my legs so that I could hold him. So they like told me this beforehand, like when I had a break, like, okay, when baby comes, we're going to hand him through and up to you. But the cord was still a good ways inside me still. And so I couldn't get him all the way up on my chest. I remember holding him really low, but the relief was incredible. I was so happy and so overjoyed that that was over. And we ended up walking to my bed. That's when I held him for about 10 to 15 minutes while we waited for the placenta to come out. The placenta coming out felt very different from the first time. I felt like the first time I had a contraction that was very noticeable and then delivered my placenta kind of easily. This time I only felt cramping and I didn't feel any contraction. And so they just told me to push, that it was essentially like detached and just waiting for me to push on it. And so I did that, and then it came out, and I birthed the placenta around 15 minutes after baby. Yeah, around 1 o'clock, I just wrote that they did an exam, and that's when I discovered that I had no tearing. I was so overjoyed with that, so happy with that. And we were left to bond with baby for about an hour where we were completely undisturbed, which was so sweet. They came back in, they did his newborn screening, they weighed him, measured him, and all of that good stuff. And I think that they left around 2 o'clock is what I wrote down. So the timeline of this was about 12 hours of total labor. 2 hours was early labor, 4.5 was early active, 4 hours of active labor, 1 hour of transition, and then about 30 minutes of pushing. In terms of his birth stats, he was born at 12:46, 12 hours of labor, he weighed 7'7", he was 19 inches long, and his head was 14. So that is the little birth story of our little Lucas. He's still snoozing, he's doing so good. He made it through the whole video. Good job, little buddy. But we're doing good. His older brother is adjusting well. He met him that same day, just in the evening around 5 to 6 p.m. My mom brought him back over after a day of playing there. So that was nice to have a few hours where we were kind of undisturbed and were able to focus on just us and Lucas. And so that was all really good. But it was such a different experience than my first birth, I will say. With Henry, it was a kind of long endurance situation. With him, it really didn't become super hard to manage. Labor didn't until the very end there. And I would even say the last 30 minutes was the only section where I felt like truly overwhelmed. Whereas I felt like there was a like 3 to 5 hour section where I had that feeling with Henry. And so having that shrunken down to just 30 minutes was such a joy. I do remember thinking though directly after, like, I am never doing that again. How could I have just birthed 2 babies at home unmedicated? Like, who does this? Why am I doing this? But then afterwards I'm like, look, this is why having this peaceful start to life, having him at home, having this first night going so well, just the transition into life afterwards is, and the, you know, flexibility of all of our choices that we were able to make from, you know, the very first positive pregnancy test to him being born and all of the choices for him, just the flexibility of choice and the peace of doing it in our home was so worth it for every step of the way. So I would continue to have births this way, even though it is incredibly hard. It does really empower you. I remember the first time I didn't really feel empowered by my first birth. I just felt like mildly traumatized by it. And it took me, I would say, like a month or 2 to kind of get out of that headspace. Whereas this time I feel like it just took like 24 to 48 hours and I was back on the, oh my goodness, I love home birth train again. He is just so precious. We're so excited to be a family of 4 now and to continue moving ahead into the holidays with our new little squish. So thank you so much for watching this video. It means so much to me that you did. Me and Lucas will catch you on the next one. Bye, friends.